The news continues to roil in Washington, D.C. over the salacious allegations that Tulsi Gabbard has leveled against former President Barack Obama, that he and his senior officials were engaged in what she calls a years-long coup. Now, as you may know from our show yesterday that we did, where I was looking at the documents that she provided, I see a number of things that in there that were plenty of nefarious and wrongdoing by some of the Obama officials, but at least in the documents that she provided, I don't see any connective tissue between what is reported and what she says was a coup, which is very important. Well, as it turns out, Larry Johnson, who's a frequent guest on our show, has some involvement with some of this from years ago, and he has a different take than I do. So we thought we would give him a chance to convince you that he's right on this, and then we'll see where it goes. This is something that Larry published in 2018, so quite a long time ago. The Trump coup is a threat to our republic. So he kind of preceded Tulsi Gabbard in this. And so I want to get into that because that really got my attention when I was reminded of this article here just yesterday. So Larry, first of all, let's just let's just jump right into it. First of all, before you start saying what you're going to say, I want to show you the latest we have from what Tulsi Gabbard is saying.
Okay.
Yes, it's manipulation and a manufacturing of false intelligence, but why it was created is the most significant thing to all Americans. President Obama and his team were unhappy with the choice the American people made in electing Donald Trump in 2016, and therefore they created this document, again, that contradicted every other piece of intelligence assessments that they saw related to this election. They created it at the protest of senior CIA officials, because they would use this foundational document for everything that came after for the following 4 years. The Mueller investigation, what was essentially a years-long coup against President Trump with the smears and the attacks, the FBI raids, the 2 congressional impeachments, the list goes on. And so this action needs to be seen within the context of what happened before and what came after to recognize the conspiracy that exists.
Now, you obviously, like we just showed there from 2018 on sonar21.com, which is your website. People can go and read this at their leisure there if they want. But we're going to talk about it in a second. But I'm actually going to start with something that happened after some of these events that you're describing here anyway. And that is a 2017 when you were actually part of the original story for the Russiagate investigation, which eventually proved that a lot of this information was false and manufactured, especially the Steele dossier, et cetera, which we'll talk in detail. But I wonder if you could just kind of walk us through what you knew at the time, how you found out, and what happened as a result.
Well, part of what I knew was coming from a source, a highly placed source within the intelligence community. I'll leave it at that. This effort to take out and to meddle in the presidential election and to put their finger on the scale in favor of Hillary, it actually started in the summer of 2015, even before Donald Trump was identified as the most likely Republican candidate. So I had that. And then I also, my own experience within the intelligence community. So for example, when that assessment came out in January of 2017, I knew reading it right away that it was male bovine excrement, because they claimed the only coordinating agencies on it were CIA, NSA, and FBI. I'm going, where's DIA? Where's state INR? Because whenever you clear off on a document that speaks for the intelligence community, normally those agencies that actually produce intelligence, and what I mean by produce, where they actually collect raw information and then it is distributed as finished intelligence to all the other intelligence agencies. Well, DIA and state, they're originators. State originates through State Department traffic. DIA, just like CIA does, has human sources overseas. So they weren't even on there. I'm going, wow, That's weird.
And by the way, do you have any either theory or did you find out why the DIA and State Department weren't part of that group?
Yeah, because they were excluded. I mean, they deliberately were cut out because this was a cooked up job. This was a fabrication. This was providing exactly as Tulsi said. This was a political hit job on Trump. It was to try to put flesh on the skeleton that had been created the previous 18 months. And when I talk about 18 months, I'm talking about going back into July, August of 2015. So this Russiagate has at least 3 phases. And what Tulsi's talking about here is what I'd call the last phase, phase 3. After Trump was elected, then they had to figure out, okay, how do we take everything that's been created prior to this and use it to destroy Trump, to paint him as an agent of Russia? And that's what I find sort of refreshing, is that Tulsi's saying that there are at least some senior analysts who held their ground and would not go along with this and protested, and they ultimately went around them. So that there's some good news in that. But this was to call this a coup, I don't think is an overstatement at all. It's exactly what it was.
So it almost sounds like, a coup. That implies that somebody who's in power, that some other force tries to get them out of power. But from what you're describing, even before Trump was the Republican nominee in 2016, that they were already starting to target him. So it almost like they didn't want him, and then they tried to undermine him. But before I get into the part about the Devin Nunes part of the story, where you really kind of take an active role, what do you see that shows you that they tried to get him out of power once he got in?
They then took out his national security advisor right away, Mike Flynn. He was impeached twice, and the impeachment for surrounding Ukraine was exactly based upon all this. I mean, this, it was then the subsequent lawsuits that flowed after he left office. And look, I do not consider myself a Trump supporter, particularly now, in light of his betrayal of his promises surrounding Epstein. But what was done to him was wrong. It probably doesn't rise to treason, but it certainly rises to defrauding the American people. But yeah, the efforts, having gone through this process of when you write something as an intelligence community judgment, and then you have to coordinate it. What coordinate means is you work with the other agencies. In this case, I'd have to call DIA. I'd have to call state INR. I'd have to call NSA. And then they would have to agree with my language. Or they'd say, no, we don't want to say that. We want to change this language. And either you would come to an agreement, or they could write a dissent. And that was allowed. But that was discouraged, is usually you try to find a way that you can come to an agreement. That's what makes her revelation so shocking, because it's not her opinion. They've got the emails. They've got the documents that show that this took place, that they were twisting the words, that they were ignoring the facts.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but 2 of the worst egregious violators of that were DNI Clapper and CIA Brennan. Is that a fair assessment? Yeah,
well, I mean, they're at the top of the chain. They're the ones that said, "Hey, shut up, sit down. We're going to do it this way."
Got it. Okay, and we're going to get to that.
But what's interesting is Brennan lied. He pretended that, I didn't want the Steele dossier in there, and I don't know how. That must have been the FBI. The man is a serial liar.
Well, and that's one of the things that I have contended from the beginning, that at least from what Director Gabbard has released, it does appear they're very compelling that he had knowledge and yet continued to say the things you're talking about there. And forget about whether this grand conspiracy, whatever, but at least on that part by itself, no matter what else does or doesn't happen, I think there maybe is some room for justice to bring something in, because that seems like it would, at least to me, I'm not a professional, but it seems like that would violate any number of laws.
Yeah, at a minimum, he perjured himself before Congress. That's number one. But it was abuse of power while in office. But hey, listen, I can tell you stories that go back to 2007 with him, where he was working on behalf of Barack Obama overseas.
Yeah, I want to get to that in a minute because I've got a whole section I want to talk about on that. Very much, we will get to that. But let's get back to this Devin Nunes stuff, because this is where you actually helped Devin Nunes, then the House Intelligence Committee chair, understand just how serious the situation was. Tell us about that.
So it was a Saturday. It was like March 5th, March 4th in 2017. News broke that Donald Trump was saying that the FBI had wiretapped his phones. And so I did one television interview at the time, actually, with Russia Today, RT, saying now that was wrong. It was GCHQ. But then I contacted Devin, because I had a conversation with with my source, and he elaborated on what had really gone on. And I knew Devin because when Devin was first appointed to the House Intelligence Committee as a member, I believe that was 2012, I had been asked to brief him, get him sort of up to speed on what the CIA was, how it operated. My next door neighbor at the time was the largest defense lobbyist in D.C., and he was trying to help Devin out. So I went and met with Devin along with another former CIA colleague. And we spent about 2 hours with him explaining the agency, how it worked, difference between operations and analysis, etc. So I had a relationship with him. We were, not beer drinking buddies, but I contacted him. I've still got the text messages today. He said, "Hey, I need to come see you about something." And so he finally carved out time, and I went in and I said, "Look, Devin, this is what was said and what Trump is saying, and it's wrong, because what's happening is the Brits are spying, GCHQ." And he goes, "Well, how does that work?" And I said, "Well, GCHQ is like our version of NSA. They can actually intercept the phone conversations, and they transcribe those conversations. And then we have this thing called liaison, where sitting right next to the GCHQ operator in London, in England, is an NSA operator. And so the Brits just pass it to us. That way you can say, well, we didn't collect it because it's illegal for the NSA to collect on Americans. And the only way you can collect those phone conversations would be with a wiretap that was authorized by a FISA court, for example. But this is the workaround. The Brits collect, the Belgians were collecting, the Australians were collecting, and then passing it over to NSA, and then NSA would distribute it to CIA, and then it got into the Intel network. So I explained that to Devin, and he goes, and I gave him a name. This is who you should talk to. This person can confirm what I'm telling you. So I think it was a couple of days later, Devin went to the White House, and he got presented with some of the documents corroborating what I was saying. And when he came out, if you recall, he was immediately attacked by the press. What are you doing? And you're, so they went full attack dog on him. But with that, he commissioned Kash Patel to start collecting the evidence surrounding this, which Kash did.
And then where did that lead? Because at the time, there's a lot of this Russiagate that Trump. It started off that he was in collusion with the Russians, that they had actually planned on doing a lot of these things together.
Yeah.
And this sort of cast some doubt on some of that. And where did this lead after that, just generally?
Well, he conducted an investigation. They prepared a report, but it remained classified and was not, wasn't released. To the life of me, here's where I think Tulsi's open to criticism right now. Why the hell wasn't this stuff released in Donald Trump's first term? It should have been released then. It would have proven what was going on. They didn't just suddenly find these documents. But
right, and that is a question I've got too. Do you have any idea why that wasn't the case, and why, like the Senate, the 3-year Senate Intel group that took a look at that, et cetera, the CIA looked at its own stuff, because on July 2nd they reported, the New York Times reported about the current CIA director saying that, well, we look back at that stuff and it was largely correct. They just
I mean,
into it. Why would he said that?
That is so much crap. I mean, they're covering their own ass. Both the intelligence community, the CIA in particular, Ratcliffe in particular. Ratcliffe, when he was director of national intelligence under Donald Trump, he had this information.
Right. That's exactly what I'm trying to have. Why would he not? And I'm talking like earlier this month, he basically said, well, we kind of agree with what happened in CIA back at the time. And then just a couple of weeks later, here goes Tulsi Gabbard talking about all this bombshell stuff. And I'm just trying to understand why those two seem to be singing different tunes.
Because Ratcliffe is compromised.
Yikes.
You know, he's not some independent member of, opposed to the deep state. He's part of the deep state.
Well, that's not helpful if you're a Trump fan.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Trump's been a moron with all of his, a lot of the people he selected to be around him. Christopher Wray, Gina Haspel, he named her a CIA director in his first term. She was the one helping run the intelligence operation in England to collect information on him. I mean, This thing, Danny, this thing started in 2015. And it started with a task force that John Brennan created then that was collecting information on all presidential candidates except for Hillary, because he was now working for Hillary. And that included, they were collecting on Ted Cruz, they collected on Marco Rubio, as well as Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. Because in the summer of 2015, nobody knew what was going to happen. However, the FBI in September of 2015 made their first attempt to entrap Donald Trump. And they did so by using a guy named Felix Sater. Felix Sater was born in Russia, but came to the United States as a child, grew up in, I believe it was Brooklyn. Guess who his boyhood friend was? Michael Cohen.
I thought you were going to say Jeffrey Epstein, but
no.
Sorry.
No, close.
Anyway, please continue on.
Michael Cohen, one of Trump's former lawyers. Again, a reminder that Trump is a terrible judge of character. He doesn't know how to hire people. Sater got into a bar fight. He was in his early 20s. He was a trader on Wall Street. It was going to be serving some prison time, but he got off because he was recruited as a confidential human source for the FBI. And the guy that signed off on his recruitment was named Andrew Weissman. Oh, yes, Andrew Weissman, who was Mueller's lead counsel on the Russiagate investigation. And so from like 1999 on, Sater was an FBI informant. He also did some work for the CIA. He helped line up some groups in Russia that were trying to collect information on Osama bin Laden. So he was known to both law enforcement and intelligence community. So September 2015, we know this from the Mueller report. They're trying to go after Trump for building a Trump Tower in Moscow. But the one that came up with that idea was Felix Sater. Sater walked in and proposed, hey, why don't we go to Moscow? Hey, let's go do this. And Trump said, no, we're not going to do that. So that was the FBI's first attempt to entrap Trump in this Russian network in September 2015. And then the collection, as the primary season started up in earnest, and it became clear that Trump was going to be the nominee, they threw away the other, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, forget about that. The focus was entirely on Donald Trump and creating this Russiagate narrative. But they planned it in advance. The example was George Papadopoulos.
Yeah, I wanted to center on that. That's again, you mentioned that in your 2018 piece. So I wonder if you can explain a little bit about what role he played, who he was, and what role he played.
Yeah, George Papadopoulos, he was a nice young kid living in London, just starting out his career. And in August, remember, he's in London. He makes a telephone call or sends a text message to Corey Lewandowski, who was the campaign manager for one Donald Trump at the time, saying, hey, I'd like to get involved with the campaign. Gee, guess who intercepted that message? That message was intercepted by GCHQ. And with that protocol that had existed, that any contact with any of the presidential candidates, it got put into a file. So this goes into a file of George Papadopoulos, but potentially working with Donald Trump. And so they started monitoring him. And lo and behold, like in December of 2015, he gets this offer to become a vice president at the London Center for International Law Practice, LCILP, an MI6 front. Okay. I mean, this is like we're making up a James Bond spy novel. And he goes there, and by January, February, he's then introduced. They insist he go to a Rome conference, and so he goes to this Rome conference, and now he's been selected as a potential advisor on energy matters to Donald Trump. So now he's moved into the Trump camp, and by February, and he's introduced to a guy named Joseph Massoud. Well, Massoud claims to have all these contacts in Russia, and he starts being a source of information for Papadopoulos. And he's the one that raises the issue later of Hillary Clinton's emails. And in fact, he brokers an introduction to the niece of Vladimir Putin. Putin doesn't have a niece, but Massoud was from Malta. But he was, when you look at all of his connections and ties, he ran in CIA and MI6 circles. So when the time came that Papadopoulos was arrested, and they got him for, quote, lying to the FBI, they had tried to set him up, though. The Israelis danced him into someone from Turkey, allegedly, and they paid him $10,000 up front. Yeah, here's the 10 grand I'm going to have you. I'll have you doing a report. And Papadopoulos goes, that's sort of strange, because he's scheduled to fly back to the United States. So he left it overseas in a secure location. When he arrived at Dulles Airport, the FBI were there. They tore through all of his. They expected to find him with the 10,000. They were going to charge him based on that. But that fell through. But it wasn't just, they weren't just going after him. They were going after Carter Page. They were going after Roger Stone. They were going after Paul Manafort. This was a full court press. But they had some surprises were thrown their way in the person of Seth Rich at the Democratic National Committee. Because Seth Rich, not the Russians, took the emails from the Democrat National Committee. And
well, yeah, and that was the next thing on your list here. You talk about the 2016 DNC hack, and in 2018 you said that there was no evidence that the Russians actually did that. And have you subsequently found any more information?
Yeah, no. In fact, that's not my opinion. That's what the FBI, the former head of FBI cyber unit, testified, because he was now the chief operating officer for CrowdStrike. And he said, no, we never actually established that it was the Russians that took the emails. Well, no kidding. The timeline tells the story, and there are two different versions of this, because Dmitry Alperovich, a Ukrainian. Here we go again. Can't get rid of Ukraine, man. It's like crabgrass. Alperovich told one story to a Washington Post reporter and another story to I forget which journal it was, but both versions say that somewhere between April 30th and May 4th, he got a frantic call. Oh, the Russians are inside the DNC server. I'm going to dispatch my emergency team to deal with this, said Dmitry Alperovich. They dispatched him. And from May 4th or maybe April 30th. Again, he got his, you couldn't tell the same story. But from either of those dates, CrowdStrike took no steps to switch off the server and clean out the virus that was taking all of the emails, supposedly. No, they didn't do that until June 10th. That was when they ordered, oh, turn everything off. We're going to get those Russians now. I worked with Bill Benny on this. Bill was a senior NSA official. He was resigned from the FBI, from the NSA in protest over their spying on Americans. But he is technically, up to speed on this. The bottom line is if those had been stolen over the internet, because there's metadata in the messages that were posted at WikiLeaks. If those had been taken out over through a web access over the internet, there would have been a different metadata on the upload, the speed of the upload. In fact, it was impossible. So what we were able to prove is it was done on a thumb drive. So how do we know it was Seth Rich? Well, when Seth Rich got in contact with Julian Assange, because Julian Assange admitted they'd been in contact. He posted a reward for information about the killers of Seth Rich. But again, this communication, it went from the United States to the Ecuadorian embassy, or to WikiLeaks headquarters. I guess Julian was in the embassy yet. The U.S. is monitoring that. CIA, along with the Brits, MI6 and GCHQ, they were monitoring every communication, both hard copies, electronic, that came in and out of WikiLeaks. And that the last date on the messages that were lifted was May 26. So, here they find out, they go, oh my God, this information has come out of DNC. It's gone to WikiLeaks. What do we do? So they had from May 26 to June 10th to come up with a solution. And their solution was this. They created this character called Guccifer 2.0. They used a set of then secret cyber tools, one called Marble. We learned about it later with when WikiLeaks leaked Vault 7, these tools that had been at the CIA. They got that from a CIA contractor who was subsequently arrested and convicted. But on that, they put metadata into the messages to make it appear like it was the Russians, including using the name of Felix Dzerzhinsky. Dzerzhinsky was the first head of the Cheka, the predecessor of, the KGB. It was, you want to, we're going to make it look Russian. Let's put in Dzerzhinsky and say niet and that kind of stuff. So it wasn't until June 10th that they shut it down. And then Alperovich, man, he's out 2 days later giving Nakashima of the Washington Post this story. Yeah, let me tell you how we stopped those Russians. And the decision to go to paint Donald Trump as a Russian stooge, the Hillary Clinton campaign, actually, it was openly discussed not openly. It was discussed in an email between a guy named Brent Badowski, an old-time Democrat operative, and John Podesta, Hillary's campaign manager, in December of 2015. And how do we know that? Well, that came out of the WikiLeaks leaks as well. So, and they were talking about, we're gonna paint Trump as Putin, work off of Putin's or Trump's bromance with Putin. That's how it was phrased. So this was a coordinated. CIA was involved. CIA was coordinating with the Brits. They were not only with the Brits, they coordinated with the Australians, because this Australian ambassador Downer, who is also a contributor to the Clinton Foundation, he's the one that supposedly started the Operation Crossfire Hurricane, because 2 months after George Papadopoulos supposedly said something about, we're going to ask the Russians for Hillary's emails, which he didn't. I never said such a thing. Downer shows up and tells the FBI, yeah, I got concerns about this American here. And that's how, I mean, was entirely a setup all along. And then throw in the Steele dossier.
Right. That's exactly. Well, you're like you reading my script here. That's exactly what I wanted to go to next. That's one thing right there with the whole DNC hack, and was Trump some of his guys part of it or whatever, or was it the Russians that were working on behalf of Trump, et cetera? That's one component, big one. The next one, and probably the most condemned part of it all, was the infamous Steele dossier. What can you tell us?
Well, the Steele dossier initially started off as some research commissioned. I forget the name of this wealthy Republican, but he was an anti-Trumper. But then they brought in Christopher Steele, was hired by Hillary's law firm to help create this. But we've now learned, that's what I knew back then. Because, look, I was doing reports not like this. I mean, this was so unprofessional and almost childish. But I would do reports for clients where they'd ask for an intel summary and you have to explain different things. It turns out that Nellie Orr, whose husband Bruce Orr was a senior official at the Department of Justice, she's the one that actually took material that Steele provided, and others. She's the one that actually wrote it now. They've determined that. So this was a complete fabrication, and some of the material in it just didn't make sense. That that the Russians were so clever that they knew that Donald Trump was going to be president in the future. That's why they were cultivating him so carefully. Whether Kreskin, the mind reader?
Yeah, because nobody in America thought he was going right up to the very end. I think it was like 95% probability that Hillary would win like a week before the election or something like that. So, wow, I guess they were smarter than all the rest of us.
Yeah. It was, this was circulated widely among the press and people, even at the New York Times. I saw you had Julian Barnes on. And again, he's just another apologist for not taking responsibility for what they did. You've yet to see the story come out where the New York Times says, "Oh yeah, we screwed up. This was a complete bogus document. No truth to it whatsoever." You still got some out there insisting, "Oh yeah, it is. It's this legitimate. This true." You don't have to like Donald Trump. Or don't let your hatred of Donald Trump blind you to the fact that this was a complete frame-up, a complete setup, and there was not a shred of truth to it. It wasn't even good propaganda. Always starts with a good foundation of truth, but this didn't even have that. It would have been one thing to have constructed it around his time running Miss Universe and his time in Moscow supervising Miss Universe pageants. But they didn't even go there. Stupid.
And that's, and we'll get into this here in a second. This whole Steele dossier, and this is what Tulsi has been talking about quite a bit in some of her comments here, continued to lay the foundation for claiming that it was intelligence, and then that fueled all kinds of things all the way through, both before the election and afterwards as well. And DNI Clapper.
Whoop. Froze there.
We'll get him back. This has been happening a little bit here and there, Larry. It usually goes for about 5 seconds or so. So we'll snap our fingers and he'll reappear.
Magic.
I hope. Here we go. We'll see what happens here. Did you want to just carry on a little bit, Larry, while we're waiting?
Yeah. Well, I'll point out that it turned out that one of the major sources that the FBI was relying on for that for the Steele dossier creation was his name Igor Danchenko, who was a Russian, born in Russia, but he's living in the United States. He was working at the Brookings Institute. He was fabricating it. He's the one, I think, that came up with the claim that Trump got peed on by a prostitute at the Four Seasons Hotel, which is you know, a germaphobe like Trump doesn't sound to me like he's into that kind of perversion. But the Steele dossier, it was only one component here, because then you also had the other aspect where the FBI they went in and lied, absolutely lied to the FISA court, and in order to secure the permission to spy on people like Mike Flynn, Carter Page, and others. I think George Papadopoulos may have got caught up in that. But this was, this was a coordinated effort. I believe the CIA had the lead on it. Obama, I have some problems with Tulsi's current presentation that this was just Obama directing this. I don't think he was trying to do damage control, because they never expected Trump to win. Once Trump won, then the next question was, okay, how do we sabotage him going forward? So they'd already laid the foundation that Russia was involved, and the Steele dossier was one component of that, but they persisted in building the circumstantial case that Trump was involved by, saying, "Oh, here's Mike Flynn. He's talking to the Russians." So all of this, they didn't have it planned out in advance of we're going to go from here to here to here to here. But what the documents that Tulsi's releasing now show is that there was direct intervention, both at the direction of Obama from the White House, and then with Clapper and Brennan interfering and directly inserting themselves into the clearance process, overruling analysts. Now, it's one thing to if you've got a factual basis and get overruled by a director of CIA, that's a problem, and that's exactly what Brennan did. It's another thing that if well, this is just our opinion. That this wasn't based on opinion. They said we don't have any evidence to support that claim. And so that's pretty egregious.
Yeah, sorry, folks. The power went out of my house, so I lost everything. We're trying to get everything rebooted at the moment, so I'm on my phone so that we can continue going on there. Thanks for the pickup, Gary. I appreciate that. I want to, though, before we get into this whole issue on Brennan and Clapper, because I think they may be the two most egregious violators of this whole thing and deserve special scrutiny, I think. I want to show you something from John Kiriakou, who's also a former CIA officer who we've had on the show in the last month or so. But he was on the PBD broadcast and made an interesting comment about Brennan himself.
John's the guy. John says, "I want to be CIA director." The liberals went crazy. They said, absolutely not. He was one of the godfathers of the torture program. Obama says, okay, I'm going to make him deputy director of the National Security Council, deputy national security advisor for counterterrorism. Then he started doing the kill list. Well, by 2012, the liberals forgot or didn't care or whatever, were distracted. They make him CIA director, and then he starts just wreaking vengeance on all of his enemies.
Wow.
This is a bad guy. John Brennan is a very bad guy. From day one, he was a bad guy.
Who liked him in the CIA?
Yeah, that's good enough there, Gary. You should watch the whole. I'd recommend anybody watch that whole interview there. It's absolutely fascinating. But Larry, you also have some interaction with John Brennan. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about. Do you agree with what John Kiriakou said?
Oh, 100%. Brennan was not trained as an operations officer. He was trained as an analyst, and he was a pretty pathetic analyst. He first showed up, a friend of mine, Pat Lang, who's now deceased. Pat was the defense attaché in Saudi Arabia when Brennan was posted there as a young analyst, and he did a terrible job. So it was only years later that Brennan went back there as the CIA chief of station to Saudi Arabia. This was 1995 when the Khobar Towers was blown up. And back then, Brennan would not allow the CIA station base, which one of my classmates was the chief of base, would not allow them to collect intelligence on terrorist threats. Brennan shut that down because he was getting, let's call it, some favors out of the Saudis. Then I ran into him again in 2004. Every year, the State Department Bureau of Counterterrorism would put out its Patterns of Global Terrorism report. Now it's called Country Reports on Terrorism. And they provide the statistics, how many groups, how many attacks, whatever. So when I'd get it, I'd go through it and read that and just keeping track of the data. Well, I got to the back page and noticed all of a sudden, you got to November, the terrorist incident stopped. And there had been actually a major terrorist attack in Russia in November, the previous year that I remembered. So I called up Joe Reep, who was the press guy at Counterterrorism Office. And he went, oh my God. Because at that time, Colin Powell was running around saying, look how great we're doing. The terrorism incidents are down. Well, they were down because you forgot to count a year's, 2 months worth of data. And the guy that was in charge of that was none other than John Brennan. He was the head of the Terrorist Threat Integration Center. He said he failed to properly check and ensure that the data was right, which was his job. He was in charge. 2007, there was efforts to, I was asked at the time, surprisingly, by the Hillary Clinton campaign to see what information I could get out of Indonesia about Barack Obama and his adoption by Lolo Soetoro. Serendipitously, good friend of mine, Chris Whitcomb, who'd been a member of the FBI hostage rescue team and now was doing contract work for CIA, he was doing training in Indonesia. So he said, yeah, I'll get what I can. He reported back. It had already been cleaned out. It was cleaned out by John Brennan, his company. So, when Kiriakou, and I know John pretty well, we're friends. When Kiriakou says that Brennan's a bad man, he's not exaggerating. Brennan's a very bad actor.
And so let's look at what do you know about D&I Clapper? And then I'm going to get into some specific questions here.
Clapper is just as bad as Brennan. I only know of Clapper secondhand from Pat Lang. Pat was the chief of the Middle East division at DIA when Clapper was the head of DIA. So he directly worked under Clapper. And he didn't have a kind word to say about the man. And then we saw Clapper lie before Congress when he was asked about spying on Americans. He absolutely knew they were spying on Americans. So, he could be the poster boy for the deep state.
Yeah, I'll actually never forget that when he just looked the camera right in the eye and just flat out said, we absolutely are not spying on Americans. And then, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was the Snowden release that confirmed that there was a massive spying on Americans. And instead of him being held accountable, because that was the first thing I thought was, okay, well, he's going down. And literally nothing happened at all. Right.
Yeah, no, they've been twisting and turning intelligence for years, and it's always been for political purposes. The fact that the way I learned about what Brennan was doing at CIA with respect to gathering the intelligence, it came through one of my other friends, a retired CIA officer. He had been he'd been overseas in a lot of hot spots, including Beirut, Lebanon, when the CIA chief of station, Buckley, was kidnapped and murdered. He was in El Salvador during that war. So he'd been in a lot of operational places. And he's the one that called me up and said, hey, I just got off the phone with one of my contacts who's still there. And this guy was approached by Brennan, asking him to be part of what they were then calling the Trump Task Force. So they'd put together a task force to go after Trump. And
Okay, so let me ask you then, based on what you've seen from the documents that Director Gabbard has released, what do you what is your, I guess, your assessment of what Clapper and Brennan did with information they knew to be false, if my understanding is correctly?
yeah, they published it. They published it as if it was true, with the imprimatur of saying, "Hey, this is the CIA community judgment." You know, so that carries some weight. Then all the newspaper, well, if the CIA says it's true, it must be true. You know,
And if because I've been through a lot of the documents that Gabbard has released, but not all of them. But she said in some of her testimony or some of her press briefings that she has emails that show that Brennan and Clapper both knew that the Steele dossier and the DNC hack was not the way it was portrayed, and yet they used it anyway to have intelligence assessments. Is that accurate?
Well, yeah, they knew. I'll give you an example. I was hired by attorney Ty Clevenger to help him in a case where one of his clients is being sued by the family of Seth Rich. And so he'd been asking the FBI and the intelligence community for information about Seth Rich. And initially they denied, oh, we don't have anything. Then, good Lord, this is, I'm going to say this is 7 years ago. He got a letter where they admitted that they had 15 documents, NSA documents, that were classified top secret that they couldn't share with him. So I checked with my friend, the one who was connected on the inside. I actually was having dinner with him, and I showed him the letter. He started laughing. He goes, 15? We got a lot more than that. So they knew. They knew Seth Rich was in touch with Julian Assange. They knew how the whole thing had happened. They have the intelligence documents. It's there. Just a simple matter of declassifying them.
And okay, so now the whole issue here that Director Gabbard's raising is that this was an Obama-driven attempt to unseat Trump. So now how do you go from where those things are with the Steele dossier, with the DNC stuff, and the Russiagate, et cetera, to getting him out of power? Because you mentioned the impeachments. The first impeachment was primarily over whether or not he used Ukraine to try and gain get a quid pro quo, et cetera. How do those things tie together?
Well, the reason I think she's saying that Obama directed this is because of that meeting that took place in early December after Trump won. Everybody was caught completely unawares that with their pants down, and nobody expected Trump to win. It was that. So when Obama calls those people into that meeting and basically says, "Okay, we need to produce an assessment showing that Donald Trump, that the Russians pulled this off for Donald Trump." It was all done for the purpose of discrediting him. Look at the subsequent actions that Obama took. They started collecting. They were monitoring Mike Flynn's phone calls. So they took the information about what he said to the Russians. They imposed sanctions immediately on Russia, kicked out a bunch of diplomats, seized property. All of this was creating this narrative that Russia had interfered, when the actual intelligence showed the exact opposite, that they had not interfered. I mean, for God's sake, when you look at the amount of interference that we do as a country in other elections overseas, my God, the Russians would have to go to school on us. The U.S. method for starting a color revolution. So this was, again, the plan was to dirty Trump up so that, one, he could not seek any kind of rapprochement with Russia. Because you got to step back and say, well, Why were all these foreign intelligence services? Why were the Brits, the French, the Belgians, the Germans, why were they willing to cooperate with the CIA going after this potential presidential candidate? Because they feared that Trump was going to do what he's doing now with respect to NATO, that he was going to soften up the U.S. was going to back away. The Europeans would have to take a bigger responsibility, and even the possibility that he might get out. And the only way you can counter that is, by God, those Russians are coming. The Russians are coming. And so to arms, so that's why they were looking for anything that they could get on Trump. That, he wasn't paying attention. I mean, that's on him. He had all this information, could have released it. He didn't. But the people around him, Mike Pompeo, John Ratcliffe, Dan Coates, who was the first ODNI, the Director of National Intelligence, Pete and Rick Grinnell, none of them collected the information, even went out of their way to say, hey, let's go back and take a look at this. This seems strange to challenge it. None of them.
And so then I guess you can just ponder why they didn't. But the Republican Senate Intelligence Committee, Republican led, certainly spent 3 years in this bipartisan thing going through there. And you would think that when it came out, especially Rubio, being a senior member of that Intelligence Committee at the time, seems like they would have had motivation. They're looking at the documents. Why wouldn't they have taken that opportunity to talk about these things if they were readily apparent?
They weren't friends of Trump. This would have been about exonerating Trump. Marco Rubio was not a friend of Trump.
Yeah, at least not then.
Yeah. Well, even right now, he'll play a role. He wants to be president. And good resume card to have is saying, hey, I was Secretary of State. But the Senate Intelligence Committee report, it's meaningless, because it was not thorough, and it did not actually look at it didn't even challenge, as I recall, they didn't come out and say, Steele dossier was a fabrication. It was. Now we've got evidence that it's a fabrication. The FBI's finally admitted it. So, but when you go back to this collection of the different informants, confidential human sources that FBI recruited, CIA using foreign assets. This was all about, they wanted to destroy Trump, and they had plenty of assistance from foreign intelligence organizations.
So where do we go from here? Because, and I've seen a number of legal scholars also weigh in that it's a virtual impossibility to actually bring Obama up on charges, if nothing else, because of the recent Supreme Court rendering, where basically they have said from Trump's last court ruling, or one of his, that you have almost complete immunity for anything that was done under your official capacity. Maybe they can try to argue that, but in law probability, that's a bridge too far. You're not going to be able to get there. But is there room for some of these other people? And should there be any charges against any of these other guys, especially the Clapper and Brennan, who seem to have been an active and willing participant in misinformation?
Clapper, Brennan, Comey, Andrew McKay, Peter Strzok, charged with perjury and charged with defrauding the American government. Because by perpetuating this fraud, this false claim that this was Russian interference and Donald Trump was under the control of the Russians, literally, I would say hundreds of millions, if not $1 billion plus, was spent chasing this nonsense. And so, that I think the charge with fraud would cover it. Now, again, I'm not a lawyer. I didn't sleep at a Holiday Inn last night, so I won't be so bold as to go out and say, that would be the charge. But it would seem to me that would be the foundation.
Well, I guess we'll see. And like Gary's showing right there, apparently they've formed a strike force to investigate that. But the last part of that headline there, though, seems is potentially going to really cause problems here too, and that's the whole Epstein thing. And in the last bit of time we have here for you, what is your position on this Epstein deal? Because obviously, the President Trump still doesn't want to talk about it. The Congress has said, yeah, we're not even going to look at it until September, maybe. But do you think that the base is going to say, all right, fine, there's these other things going on, we'll just ignore this and forget about it?
No. In fact, the public opinion polls show, particularly for people under 30, they are like 60%, 70%. They've turned against Trump. They went from being like 60% optimistic, yeah, great, Trump's in, to now it's like, they spit on him. It is, when you've got podcasters with the clout of Candace Owens, who's getting sued by Brigitte and Emmanuel Macron. She was an early supporter of Donald Trump. And in contrast to Mark Levin was an anti-Trumper as tough as it could be. But now all of a sudden, Trump's calling Candace Owens stupid and embracing Mark Levin. So, yeah, again, Trump shows no loyalty to the people who actually stood behind him when very few did. So this Epstein thing's not going to go away. And unfortunately, Tulsi, I believe that's why this information was released now, to distract. It's the shiny object to try to distract the dog from chasing the squirrel. But the attention is going to remain focused on Epstein, and it's not going to go away. And all Trump needed to say was, you know what? We're not going to have her produce a list of clients, because there's not a list of clients. There are names of individuals who've been identified by victims as well as employees of Jeffrey Epstein, such as chauffeurs, cooks, housekeepers, pilots, flight attendants, where they have named names of people, of men, prominent men, that were involved with these underage girls. So the way you handle that is you take that information, you investigate it, you see if you can corroborate it. Is this just somebody who's making a name up because they have an animus against this person? Or is there substance to it? Well, we saw in the case of Prince Andrew, there was substance to it. He paid out millions of dollars. But conduct the investigation, then present the evidence to a grand jury and get an indictment. Trump could have done that in his administration, didn't do it the first time. Biden could have done that, didn't do it. Obama couldn't have done that, didn't do it. And the reason they're not doing it is there are so many high-profile Republican and Democrat donors, wealthy men, on that list that have been identified, not the list, but have been identified by these victims, that there's definitely smoke there. It needs to be looked at. So,
well, yeah. I mean, maybe there's not a what's his face, an Epstein created list. Maybe he didn't have his black book, but there is definitely can be created and made a list out of existing information, and that can be produced. And I think that there's more than enough evidence available. I know there is, because we've just heard that Pam Bondi had apparently huge numbers, hundreds of people dedicated to work on this stuff. So there are files out there, and you can create a list. And I love your idea there. I think it's exactly what we should do. Investigate it, because you don't want just people claiming something and then it turns out that there's no substance, because now you've impugned somebody unnecessarily. But if there is evidence between that, and I think one of your headlines on one of your Sonar 21 pieces was, there's $1 billion is not a hoax. So right. People aren't paying out that kind of money unless there's something there. And I personally am like, I don't think that a bunch of money should protect a rich person from paying a price for what they did, or being held accountable for what they did. And I'd like to see some justice done there.
Well, there has been a list. Ryan Dawson was the first one to go through all the court documents that were available at the time and pull out the names of people that had been identified by victims as having been involved with them sexually. So he's produced a name. It's about 78 names. You've got former Senator and Governor of New Mexico, Bill Richardson, who's now deceased. He's on the list. Jamie Dimon of J.P. Morgan is on the list, which is interesting because J.P. Morgan Chase had to pay out $290 million in a class settlement of a civil suit because they were handling the money that Epstein was using to traffic these young women. So yeah, there's, like I said, there is some there, but this has been so poorly mishandled by both Pam Bondi and by Donald Trump that Trump is I think he's frightened because he was close friends with Jeffrey Epstein for 15 years. And I know I've people I've been close friends with we're no longer friends and we're no longer in contact. So that does, just because you had that 15-year relationship doesn't necessarily implicate you in something nefarious, but don't pretend that there's nothing there. Don't, it's like if you had a bad first marriage and you're divorced, don't pretend that you never married the woman in the first place. Okay. It's part of history. Just move on from it and say, oh, I made a mistake or whatever.
Yeah, well, we'll see because, the longer Trump doesn't want to do that and doesn't want to come clean on all this stuff and release stuff, the more grist it gives for people to say, well, there is something in there. Maybe there is something he's hiding, et cetera, because they don't have any evidence to counter that. And if there's not, I mean, it's in his interest to validate his claim of innocence, which they can do. So we'll wait and see how that works out, I guess.
Yeah, well, there's a videotape now circulating to show Jeffrey Epstein's one of his depositions. He's asked specifically, did you ever see President Trump in the presence of females under the age of 18? And Epstein pled every amendment in the Constitution. I plead the 4th, the 5th, the 16th, the 25th. Hike.
Yeah, I saw that. That's
yeah.
I mean, he didn't answer the question, but it seemed like he didn't want to answer it. So that just gives more evidence that, or more, I guess, grist for the mill for people to say, no, there really is something there, but we're left to wonder. Because
just before he's asked that question, in the previous question, he's asked something. He says, no, that didn't happen. So he didn't have any problem saying no, but when it came to a question like that, I'm taking the 5th, the 4th too. I'll take the 8th and 9th as well,
Yeah. Yeah. He said, I'd like to answer that question, but yeah, would you though? Well, anyway, I guess we're not going to get it all solved today, but this has been a very, very illuminating episode here, and the stuff you've shown here, really, really good. Appreciate that. This is on Larry's page right now. The Tulsi Gabbard's Revelations. Why now? You can go read that on Sonar 21. You can get lots of good stuff from Larry on Sonar 21, and we've had the good fortune of having you on twice in 1 week, so that's pretty awesome for us.
That's awesome. I appreciate the invite. I'm honored.
And always, we love to have your insight, especially because you've had such a direct role in a lot of this stuff. So it's really illuminating. But we appreciate it, and we appreciate you guys for joining us too. And we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.